Alrighty, Aphrodite, welcome back. You just can't get enough of learning. Lesson 3 today, everyone. So, highlight the lesson 3 that we have here. We're going to be looking at additional course concepts in today's lesson. Make sure you date it as well. So, what we can see here is again, heading for the lesson, our syllabus stop point in which we're examining today. So we're going to be looking at the additional course concepts. Again, these appear in absolutely every single topic that you will do, so it is essential that you know them inside and out. So we're going to start with power. So power is the ability or the capacity to influence or persuade others to a point of view or action they wouldn't normally do. That is the hardcore definition of power there, and I want you to highlight that because that's important. Now, a little digressive kind of comment here. When we're looking at definitions and course concepts in society and culture, it's really important that you know that whatever the syllabus says the definition is king. Okay? If you Google power, it might say something a little bit different. But you don't want to hear about it. The SAC markers only care about the definition that is in the syllabus. Alright, so it's really essential that you don't mix course concept definitions with Google definitions or the Macquarie Dictionary or whatever it is. Most of the time they're probably very similar and on par, but it's really important that you use the wording that is prescribed in the syllabus, which I've reflected here for us, so don't stress. Anyway, so power. The ability to influence or persuade someone to do something they wouldn't normally do. Power doesn't have to be limited to physical prowess, although that is an important part. I'll just highlight that as well. So it's not limited to physical because it can also be psychological. Okay, so you can manipulate someone in a bad way, and that might make them do something that they don't want to normally do. So for example, peer pressure is a great example of power there. Another one is persuasion. As part of sales tactics, people might try to upsell you to a different product. They're using their power there, the power of a language. Another sort of idea of power is incentives and rewards. Okay, so the idea that your parents might say something like, if you get an A on your report, we'll take you to Disneyland. Alright? That is them using psychological power as an incentive and a reward to get you to behave in a certain way that they want. And that's really what power is all about. It's about shaping people's behavior to expected social norms or cultural norms. Let's write that bad boy down. If you want to annotate that somewhere here, that power is used to shape behavior to societal expectations or cultural expectations. And again, that can operate at micro, meso, macro levels. Schools do it with incentive reward programs. We've got engagement levels. We've got in HISI, the Griffin of the Week. We've got vouchers we give out. All of those is trying to get you, is using our power to try and change your behavior to what we deem is socially and culturally acceptable for us. So for the HISI Griffin of the Week, we value hard work, we value people who engage in the classroom, and we reward that with a certificate, a letter, phone call home, and a juicy Facebook post. So that's power there. But it can also be physical power. The bully that picks you up by your ankles, shakes you down for all your money, and then they'll run to the canteen, or the good old-fashioned swirly, head in the toilet, plus flush. That's physical power, right? And using, I guess, a physical threat or power is a way that a lot of people will get you to alter your behavior, to take either, as our definition says, a point of view or action that you wouldn't normally take without that presence of power there. Siblings are a classic example of this. I'll give you a knuckle sandwich if you don't clean my room. Alright, authority. Authority is different to power. They are very closely linked, but they're not the same thing. So authority is the right to make decisions. Okay? That's the key distinguishing factor. It's the right to make decisions, and it's the legitimate use of power. So if I go back to that sibling example, right? Your sibling might have the power to physically restrain you. Okay? Don't clean my room. I'm going to give you a knuckle sandwich or whatever. All right? And I'm going to put you in a bear hug lock until you do it, right? That's using power. Do they have the right to do that? Do they necessarily have the legitimate legal right to do it? No, they don't, okay? Technically, your parents have the legitimate legal right over you until you turn 18. And it's the same if we look at things like peer pressure. So you might be in a social situation where you're peer pressured to engage in risk-taking behaviours, whether that's driving without a license, drinking alcohol, doing some nasty drugs, whatever it might be. You certainly all have the power to do that. You have the power to light up a joint, smoke a cigarette, take a swig of beer, whatever it is, but you don't have the authority to. You don't have the legitimate right to be able to do that. Only an adult 18 years or over has the right to do that. And sometimes even being an adult doesn't give you the right to do things, okay? Such as the illegal drugs I referred to. Whereas some people have the authority to do something. So if we're talking about physical restraints, a police officer has the power to do that, but they also have the authority to do it under certain circumstances. So whereas I, as a citizen, if someone's mucking around on the street, I don't have the authority to arrest them. I might have the power to restrain them, but I certainly don't have the authority, whereas a police officer, and I'm sure a few other professions do as well. So that's the difference between power and authority. Authority is the right, the legal right to be able to do it. It's important to notice that difference. Right, next concept off the block is identity. So you might remember that when we looked at persons up here, we said this is very closely linked to identity, and it's true because it is. So what identity refers to is the sense of self. And it's really important that you understand that that can be viewed at a personal, social, and cultural level. So you guys have 3 different sort of types of identity. And they change depending on who you're with and what level of society you're operating at. And I'm going to talk to you about a few examples like that. So your personal identity is almost your micro level identity, right? It's your truest form of yourself. It's the person who you are like when you are with family, friends, close friends. I should probably make a distinction there. It's the people that you are most likely to be your truest self around, right? That's your personal identity. And it's also the person you know in your head, that's who I am. Your social identity is who you are when you're in a social setting. So typically that's at a meso and can be kind of at a micro level, but typically meso and macro level. That's who you are when you're with your group of friends, or the social identity you portray on social media, on your Instagram feed, I'm sure isn't 100% accurate to what your true personal identity is, but that's the identity and sense of self that you're portraying to the meso and macro world through your social media accounts. So you have that kind of social identity, who you are when you're with other people. And certainly who you are when you go to work might be really different to who you are when you're with your mates, might be really different to who you are when you're with your grandparents. So even at a meso micro level, if we look at the micro example of how you behave and conduct yourself in front of your grandparents versus your parents versus your brothers and sisters, I'm sure all 3 are really different. So you sort of have different identities depending on the audience, the level of society you're at, and whether it's a personal or social sort of identity there. The third one is cultural. So your cultural identity is really referring to your ethnicity and your culture, and I guess the background of who you are and where you come from. So, for example, my cultural identity stems back to Vikings in Norway, which is cool. Still can't grow a beard to save my life, but that's fine. I'm only part Viking, I guess. So that's part of my cultural identity, and I think up to 4 or 5 generations of my personal family history has all been within Australia, up into when convicts came here, and then before that it was in England, before that it was Irish, and then it goes to Scandinavian, Norway in particular. So that's kind of the cultural identity. I take that on, but it's also, cultural identity can also be other things. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be about countries and things like that. It can also be based off gender. So your cultural identity of whether you identify as male, female, or something different is part of your cultural identity as well. The fact that if you're part of a Western culture and you engage in Western cultural practices like Christmas and New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, Halloween, whatever it is, they're kind of like a Western cultural things that you can portray as part of your identity as well. So that's really important to note. Can you on the side here, can you underline personal, social and cultural identity? But on the side here, can you also write, I do it a lot, but micro, meso, macro, because that's going to get you thinking about all the different levels in which these types of identity can engage in. So with that being said, your identity is formed over a period of time. It's not something that's static. Look, I've put it here. It's a result of interactions at the micro, meso and macro levels of society. So it's there for you anyway. So I don't know, no harm in having that twice, I suppose. But they're formed over a period of time. That's the main thing. So your identity changes, and it's not fixed. Actually, can you annotate that here as well? Is it your, just write, identity can change. So who you are right now is going to be very different to who you are in 5 years' time. Even your social and cultural identity can change. So like, let's say like someone's cultural identity can change if they find out that they have an ancestor from a certain culture or heritage. That can change entirely how they view themselves and how they portray themselves to the world at different levels. So identity is not fixed. It's not fixed. The main contributing factors to someone's identity, though, as we kind of looked at, are all of these things. So gender can influence your identity. Sexuality can influence your identity, you know, whether you identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, whatever it is. Family, you know, whether you're from a big family, a small family, an extended family, a nuclear family, all of those things can contribute to your personal and social identity as well. Your ethnicity, your beliefs, so if you're religious or not, that's part of your identity too. Your social status. So what I mean by that is that it's probably a thing that happens when you're older, but when you introduce yourself to someone new, a lot of the question that they often ask is, oh, so what do you do? And they're looking at your social status. So what do you do as a job? So for me, I'm a teacher. So my social status depends on how much people value education. Some people think I'm on par with doctors. Some people think I'm worse than garbage collectors. That's their opinion, they're entitled to it, whatever. But your social status is part of your identity too. There are certain professions that you can look at that typically always have a high social status. So things like doctors, lawyers, everyone typically views them quite highly. So that's part of your identity as well as things like national pride. So if you're someone who takes pride in your country, wherever that is and wherever you're from, that can form part of your identity as well. It has dimensions and layers that can create a sense of inclusion in a group or culture as well. That's also important. So that's part of the identity. So for me, I'm a big Arsenal fan. Arsenal is a football club in England. Some people call it soccer, but it's football because you're using your foot on the ball. Makes sense to me. That's given me a sense of inclusion in a sporting culture. I identify as an Arsenal fan, and that shapes my behaviour. It shapes my beliefs about other teams in the league who are definitely substandard to us because, you know, we're top of the league at the moment. So that can shape your identity as well. And it gives you a sense of inclusion, which if you want to annotate below here, is a sense of belonging, right? You feel like you belong in that group. It's a safe net. You're treated equally and equitably there. Gender. Our next one. So this is the socially constructed difference between males and females. And I want to stress that this is, again, the syllabus's definition of it. I am very aware that gender's scope of definition has broadened. That it's not just about the socially constructed differences between males and females. But our syllabus, as you can see here, verbatim stipulates that here. It was written in 2013, so that might be why. However, with that being said, SAC teachers are pretty left-leaning, and you know, if in a test you say gender is more than that, you're not going to get marked down, okay? But you just want to include that language, and then you can add XYZ after that. So that's what we're looking at when we're looking at gender. So that can really shape your experience at micro, meso, macros level. If we look here, that the idea that your family life, your roles, work, behavior, and other activities are organized by gender difference, that's something that's still really prevalent in today's society. So for example, if we just look at school, you've got boy change rooms and girl change rooms, boy and girl bathrooms, you have a boy and a girl uniform. So our roles and how we identify with genders certainly changes how we interact in society. You know, even as little kids, like if I go to buy my son Patrick clothes, they've all got trucks on them, cars, dinosaurs. Very rarely will it have a princess or a butterfly or something like that, because that's not associated with the macro level understanding of what a boy's gender falls into. So those differences still exist. If you look at the role of parents, there's different beliefs surrounding that. The traditional role is that the male is the breadwinner, so to speak. They go out, they do the work, they earn the money, and the traditional role of a female is the domestic sort of duties of staying home, looking after the kids, all of that sort of stuff. Those roles experience change over time, and they're really dynamic. Some people still adhere to the traditional roles, other people are more modern and contemporary and have, I guess, more of a 50-50 split, and it's becoming less based on gender and more based on individuality. So if I was to look at, for example, my own micro world at home, I do the vacuuming of the house, I do most of the cooking. So I guess I'm taking those parts of the domestic roles. That's not because I'm a man or because I identify as a woman. It's just because I feel like as an individual I'm better at those things than my partner. No offense. I mean, Ellie's a great cook, but I just cook better. So that is where gender's becoming less of a determining factor in people's lives. But it still really is really implicit, and a lot of the underlying behaviours we still do are very much controlled by that. Like my fresh haircut I just got today is very much based around that gender archetype that men have short hair. So there's still lots of different elements where gender really rings true there. So gender here also refers to cultural ideas, identities and stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, which is basically what I sort of just talked about with all those examples there. Actually, what I will get you to do is on the side here, maybe write an example of where a cultural identity is split because of gender. So you might want to use the typical husband-wife archetype that we spoke about there. You might want to look at boy and girl uniforms in school, whatever it is. Just write a little example on the side here. That'd be really good. And the last thing is that gender reflects the value a society places on these social constructs. So the view of gender very much changes depending on the society that you're living in. In a Western society and Western culture, it's a bit of a blend. I would argue, as much as we say we're all about equality and equity, how gender is still represented in our society is still quite traditional, but it is changing. It is changing a lot. So there's elements there, whereas if you go to another society like the Middle East, gender roles are very, very different. Men typically have a lot more power and authority, but even then that's starting to have some minute changes there. Then other societies like Scandinavian society is very much gender parity and equality is a reality. Alright, next one, technologies. So technologies, that refers to all the tools we use to assist our interactions in society. So that's what technology is all about. So things like internet, phones, mobiles, as they used to be called, computers, social media, all of that's part of the technology space in the world. It could lead to innovation and initiate change at different levels of society. Micro, meso, and macro, I think that's fairly obvious. The value, however, placed on technologies at any level of society influences the rate of change to society and culture. So some, I guess, countries embrace technology more than others. Australia, for example, is a country that's really behind or backwards in terms of technology adaptation. You know, we still use fossil fuels. We're not as developed in the electric car scene as a lot of other countries are. Of course, there's lots of different challenges there, but typically we're 2, 3, 4 steps behind what we would call of the rest of the progressive world. So if we look at countries like Japan, certain parts of Europe, who are much more progressive with technology than we are. So the value placed on technology influences the rate of change that it will affect on a society. Technologies are constantly changing and adapting over time. That's a pretty important one to note. And because they're constantly changing over time, and it's something that's changing exponentially. That's what I want you to write here. So exponentially, I'll write it down here for you so you can pause it and make sure you get it. My mouse has gone off it. Exponentially. So that's how you spell it. Put it there. So what exponentially means is that something is increasing at a really, really rapid pace. So slow change kind of goes like this. It might be going up. Exponential growth is this. So, for example, exponential growth is if 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 4 is 8, 8 plus 8 is 16, or that's kind of normal change, but if you go 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16, 16 times 16 is 256, 256 times 256 is whatever that is. That's exponential growth. It's growing really rapidly. So that's something to note there as well. And that they also facilitate interaction between micro, meso, macros levels of society. You know, you can call your grandparents, you can text someone, you can send a DM, slide in there, whatever it is. Okay, so technology assists our communication. So it facilitates interaction. That's another key point. Last one is technology is pretty straightforward, I think. Yeah. Also enjoy this tech meme. I thought it was classic. Love The Simpsons. Globalization is the last one. So this is the process of, or the syllabus definition is it's a process of sharing of goods, capital, labour, services, knowledge, leisure, sports, ideas and culture between countries. Typically, I want you to focus on a few things. It's the process of integration between cultures and countries, but I really want us to think of, it's all of these things, but it's very much about ideas and culture between countries. That's the main thing. So when we talk about globalization of consumerism, for example, the idea that we consume things at a rapid rate, that very much started with Western countries only. So, typically England, America, that sort of thing. And then those ideas of mass consumerism has branched off into the rest of the world, and they now follow those similar trends that America and England do with terms of like high consumerism, buying a new phone every year, fast fashion, all that sort of stuff. That has become a globalized trend. But globalization is also about technologies and social media. And I guess the main idea is what it says in this last sentence here. It results in an increasing consciousness of the world in a single place. So the fact that we're able to share ideas so quickly is part of globalization. Now, the other thing I want you to do is I want you to draw a big old arrow between globalization and technology, because you can't have one without the other. The only reason the world is so globalized right now is because our rate of technology is changing rapidly and we're communicating very quickly. So I want you to draw a big arrow between globalization and technologies there. I'll quickly go through the last little bit of what I want us to do in this lesson. So I want you to distinguish the difference between power and authority, and I want you to provide an example to support your response based on our discussion earlier. Distinguish literally means to draw the differences between things. So I've kind of given you a little prompt there. So tell me the difference between power and authority with an example here. Question 2 is list an example of power and an example of authority in your micro, meso, and macro world. So I've got that labelled out there for you. Try and write them in based on our discussion. If you can't remember, you can always rewind back to the point where we were talking about those concepts. Next question is I want you to explain how one of the following affects your identity, and I want you to provide an example to support your response. So circle, highlight, underline, whichever one it is you're going to look at. I just want you to briefly explain how that affects your identity. So let's say, for example, you might go sexuality, you might say I'm heterosexual, and how does this affect your identity? I want you to write a reason there. If it's ethnicity, your culture, or if it's your beliefs, let's say you're religious or not religious, and you don't necessarily have to be religious to have beliefs. You might be a passionate vegan, you might be really passionate about sport, culture and how that brings everyone together, whatever it is, how does it affect your identity? Next question is, I want you to list at least one male and one female gender stereotype that has experienced change over time. So on this line, if you write female equals and then just write what the change is very briefly, and then male equals and write what the change is. So for example, it might be females used to do domestic duties at home, but now they're more included in the workplace. Something as simple and quick as that might be an example of a stereotype that has changed over time. Lastly is, how has communication technologies such as phones, internet, social media impacted the rate and direction of change? I want you to provide a contemporary example to support your response. So impacted the rate is how quickly, and the direction of change is almost to what extent has it changed. I don't literally mean like has it directed it right, left, up, down, that sort of thing, but what rate has it, the direction. So for example, a direction of change with social media might be people are more likely to communicate less in person and more online now. That's kind of a direction of change. So kind of think about like what's the impact of it, and provide a contemporary example to support your response. Remember, contemporary means modern, current, up to date. I don't want an example of how the landline in the 1900s changed communication between your great grandmother, and I don't want that. I want contemporary examples. Thank you. All right, once you've done that, all I've got here is a very quick visual mind map of concepts, if you like. So what I want you to do with this is use this to brainstorm different things. So you've done your concept cards, right? On the side where you have the single word, so let's say for example power, I also want you to draw an image that reminds you of power. So for me, it's the fist of the Black Lives Matter movement, or the fist of any revolt or riot against the system, typically uses that power of the fist. For me, when I think about authority, I think of a judge's gavel and law scales, because that they have the authority to use their power. So I want you to go through all your concept cards, and just on the part where it says power, authority, culture, society, whatever, I want you to draw an image that will remind you of what that definition is. You might draw this really handsome guy over here. I don't know. It's up to you. But please do that. And then a very similar, almost identical summary task as what you did with the fundamental course concepts is I would like you to briefly outline how each additional concept, which is these ones here, affects your personal life. Again, micro, meso. I'll allow you to go macro level here if you want as well, but bonus points if you can stick to micro, meso. All right, that's it. Enjoy.